we'll start with launch on warning, since that's sort of what I was already getting into with that story. The issue of launch on warning, or some people call it hair trigger alert, is exactly what is described. That the issue comes down to we have the nuclear triad. So we have air, land, and sea. And in the nuclear triad, the air and sea missiles that we have are not inherently vulnerable to attack, but the land based nuclear part of the triad is vulnerable because they are in fixed locations. Mm-hmm.
And their locations are known.
Yeah, right? Fixed and known locations, mostly throughout the Midwest.
The nuclear sponge, that amazes me that's like what it is called. I just could not.
Yeah, the nuclear sponge, which for those of our listeners who are not familiar with, is the really morbid term that nuclear wonks and defense industry people give to the area in the Midwest where the ICBMs, the land-based nuclear missiles, are scattered around, because the idea is that it would absorb a first nuclear attack, that it would be a sponge for all of the first launched nuclear weapons that would come to the U.S. So, if you live in Iowa and Idaho, I apologize. The defense industry thinks that you are disposable. They think that you are just there to just be a target for other nuclear weapons aimed at the United States. And the way that it's talked about in a lot of defense industry areas is so blasé. It's, you'd lose $1 million here, you'd lose $1 million there. But, we would retain X amount of usable nuclear weapons after this horrible, devastating attack, which would be absorbed by the nuclear sponge.
That's crazy. It's so crazy to me it's almost impossible to not be involved in this and just start thinking about numbers. Like, I don't think the human brain is capable of constantly carrying around all that, just the emotional baggage that comes with thinking of millions of people dying, That's
one of the real problems when it comes to trying to translate nuclear issues to the general public is exactly that. Like, our human brains are not able to comprehend the scale of these things. Like, when I say that the hydrogen bombs, which are the majority of all nuclear weapons that we have in our arsenal, are hundreds of times more powerful than the atomic bomb or atomic bombs which were used on Hiroshima. So that's 15 kilotons versus 1,000 kilotons. You can't have the sense of scale of, okay, well, Hiroshima as it is, Nagasaki as it is, incredibly difficult to grasp. But then you multiply that by hundreds of times over and say, well, that's what we're talking about today. It's Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the entry point for nuclear weapons, and now we are in the big leagues. And that's one of the reasons why with the podcast, we really tried to go in this direction of focusing on these personal stories, because it tries to cut through that difficulty of, okay, I can't grasp the notion of, 500,000 people died in Hiroshima, or that this many people got radiation poisoning, or that this many kilotons would decimate this many hundreds of thousands of people. But I can understand when someone describes to them that the feeling of having your nerves burned off from the heat of the atomic explosion that you witnessed at 13 years old, and the fact that you had to undergo surgeries for years to be able to function again, and your parents thought you were going to die in front of them. Like, people can connect with that. Mm-hmm. But it is still important to talk about the numbers and to get a general sense. And let's see, I'll bring it back to
the launch on warning. Sorry, a little tangent there, but that's okay.
We're going into launch on warning, hair trigger alert. And I'll touch on ICBMs because those two issues are interrelated. Mm-hmm. as I was describing, the ICBMs, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles, which is what ICBM stands for, because, of course, the military loves acronyms indefinitely. Those are the land-based nuclear missiles that we have. Those are in silos, in fixed locations in the Midwest. And I mean, you can go on Google Earth right now and you can see them. And there are maps out there that show, okay, here's the little scattered around. These are where they are. And those are being targeted right now by Russia, by China, by our enemies with nuclear weapons, as we are targeting their land-based nuclear missiles at the same time. And that's where hair trigger alert, launch and warning comes into play, because there is this pressure, because they're being targeted. If an enemy, a nuclear enemy, were to launch a nuclear attack, it is the prevailing strategy that they would first try to take out as many of our nuclear weapons as possible so that we couldn't launch a retaliatory strike back at them. That means obviously trying to take out our ICBMs first and foremost, as well as whatever else they're launching at. So when it comes down to it, when we would be getting the word saying, okay, there's a attack incoming, and the word gets to the president, this is about to happen, roughly we would have about 5 to 10 minutes is the general understanding, considering, let's say it's coming from Russia, you have about 30 minutes before they land, and 20 minutes they get notified by the time the word gets up and that we have confirmation. Then we're running about 5 to 10 minutes once the president has been notified that this is definitely happening, we've confirmed it, what do you want to do? And that's where the dilemma comes in, is you are now asking the president, say, do you want to launch a attack back, or do you want to just let them get destroyed and take our chances? The problem is that most people look at this like, oh, well, it's a bit of a false dichotomy, because you have this notion that, oh, well, if we don't launch them, then we're disabled, that we can't defend ourselves. But that's not true, because we have the other two legs of the triad. We have the air and the sea-based legs of the triad, and those are hundreds and hundreds of nuclear weapons, which are perfectly capable of launching a retaliatory strike in the event of an attack. But what this does is it puts the pressure on someone to make a snap decision about whether to launch hundreds of nuclear weapons in minutes. And that is insane.
Yeah, it is.
And unfortunately, generally, the prevailing thought is that, yes, you would want to launch them because you want to have as much firepower available to you. But this is where the threat and the risk of false alarms is so scary.
Yeah.
The reason why the incident that my grandfather experienced, where he was woken up at 2 a.m. with an announcement that there was 100 ICBMs incoming from the Soviet Union, was so terrifying, was the fact that it was wrong, that it was a training tape put into the system saying that this was happening, and they were deceived. And it was literally minutes away. Like Brezhnev was on his way to wake up the president when they got the word that, yes, we figured out this was incorrect. And, false alarm, this was incorrect. But if that hadn't happened, he could have made the decision to launch nuclear weapons by accident.
Yeah.
And would have started a nuclear war by accident. And it honestly wouldn't even have been his fault per se. It's the problem is the scenario in and of itself. That shouldn't be a scenario that we put anyone in a decision-making place to be. No. Because you cannot make a reasonable decision about that, something that could result in the end of civilization in 5 minutes.
Yeah, and it's also, the thing that strikes me about the launch on warning thing is what the question is really, okay, we're about to be destroyed. Should we take everyone out with us is really the question. It's like, it's not even it's not even like, oh, should we defend ourselves? It's like, no, should we just kill everybody? Like, should we just end the whole thing? It's such a weird thing to think about it. It's hard to fathom being in that position.
And so the reason why the discussion about ICBMs is linked, and one of the things that my grandfather talks about in the button and has been advocating for is to actually get rid of the land-based leg of the triad entirely to get ICBMs. And right now, we're actually in a really critical point for that because the ICBMs are aging out. They need to be retired. They are several decades old. They have reached the point that they are soon going to not be reliable. Mm-hmm. So what's happening is the military is undergoing a process, what's called nuclear modernization, which is actually a term that is an umbrella term for actually a much larger program that is revamping lots of different parts of the nuclear infrastructure. But part of that nuclear modernization program is to completely rebuild our ICBM force, make an entirely new series of ICBMs. It's actually going to be called something different. But that price tag is several $1 billion for stuff, just to do that. So first, there's a financial incentive here that, particularly right now in the middle of the pandemic, and we have a lot of infrastructure issues that we are spending billions and billions of dollars to recreate these weapons, which actually make us less secure. Mm-hmm. Because they make us vulnerable to false alarms. They make us vulnerable to launch on warning problems. And they don't actually provide anything we don't already have because the air-based leg of the triad and the sea-based leg of the triad are both completely robust and secure enough to support in our ability to deter an attack and to respond to an attack if necessary. That sort of those getting rid of the ICBMs and dealing with the hair trigger alert, like you can sort of go about it by either making a policy where you're not going to launch on warning, mm-hmm. or you could just take out the problem entirely by getting rid of the things that would motivate you to launch on warning.
Right.
Both would be great.
Yeah, we'll take either one. I want to just, before we move on, I'm assuming you're ready to move on to the next policy issue. But before we do, I just want to kind of repeat back what I've been hearing you say in sort of a short way to make sure this is wrapped up nicely for listeners. So essentially we have hundreds of ICBMs, land-based missiles in the United States that, because the most likely attack from a country like Russia would be targeted at those missiles on land, the incentive then is on first alert that the attack is coming to use them so that we don't lose them, right? That's the launch on warning problem, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Just want to make sure that like we have everything nice and
yeah, it's easy to go down the nuclear rabbit hole and things get real squirrely from there. I find it interesting that I've done a number of different talks with my grandfather, been a moderator for talks that he's been doing online lately. And when he talks about this issue, oftentimes we get these questions where people say, oh, well, what should we do if we get rid of the ICBMs? Like, won't we be vulnerable? Or should we deal with the hair trigger alert problem? Like, who should make the decision? Should it just be more than one person, or is it just the time factor? And it's always surprising because people have the sense that there's a sense of urgency around this issue. And I think mm-hmm. it's because of the way that it's often portrayed in movies and in popular media that, oh, the nukes are coming, we got to do something right now. But actually, no, you don't. The truth is, if nuclear weapons were incoming, things are going to get bad.
Yeah.
It's going to be devastating. And launching nuclear weapons in response is not going to do anything to prevent that.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of a disconnect there that people don't realize, oh, well, if you launch these right away, it won't change what's about to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the real key thing we need to remember. You brought up saying, "Oh, we're all in a rush to destroy the other side." Well, what is that really a rush?
Yeah. Is that urgency a relic of Cold War thinking? I mean, is that just because of there were two sides during the Cold War who legitimately were concerned that there would be a first strike from the other side? Like, where does that sense of urgency come from? What?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think it is definitely a little bit of a relic of the Cold War. And I think it is a relic out of this notion of we are going to get this, what they used to call a bolt out of the blue, that they would just strike out of nowhere, and we need to be ready, and that they'll probably just keep hammering home. And we need to be ready at any moment to respond so that they know that they can't keep going.
It's just the deterrence factor. And then it's a weird thing. You set up this model of deterrence, but then it requires you to actually commit to those actions, or at least say you're committed to them. I don't know. So the logic behind the whole thing is just so mind numbing to me.
And it's interesting if you start looking into how the Soviets were approaching this issue on the other side of everything, and you talk to the people who were there. You talk to, like my grandfather, his compatriots on the other side, since they now actually have relationships and have talked about this, that they were actually thinking the same thing. What they were worried about was, the Americans are going to launch a surprise strike. They're trying to take us out. We need to be prepared for that. That's what we need to be on alert for. There was never any plan from the Soviets to launch a surprise attack against the United States. There was never any intention that was a good idea to do. Mm-hmm. The only fear, the predominant motivator for both sides was we're afraid that you're going to attack us. So we need to make sure we can respond to that. And then that was what they were both thinking.
Yeah. It's just a lack of trust between the two sides, right? So I guess we're kind of getting away from the policy, which is fine, but I do want to go back there. But how do you view then like the current situation with the US and Russia? I mean, in the book, looking into this, it's like you said, it seems pretty clear that neither leader really wants to do this, but it came from a place of not trusting the other side. And it seems like we're back there. Like we had the presidential election in 2016 with Russian interference, and now there's a lot of mistrust in our government regarding Russia. Do you look at that and fear for a similar issue, a similar thing happening as happened during the Cold War?
I do. I'm very concerned about that we have lost so many of the communication channels in the past number of years that we have with Russia, whereas they are, of all the countries, Russia in particular is who we need to have this robust, strong, reliable communication with, because we have so many nuclear weapons. And just to dip our toes a little bit into the numbers game.
Yeah, do it.
Just for context, which is always important. When we're talking about numbers of nuclear weapons in the world, there's about 15,000, and 90% of those are in the United States or in Russia. So we each have about 7,000 nuclear weapons, and then you have a smattering in all the other ones: China, Israel, Germany, et cetera, et cetera.
That's total. That's not deployed, right? That's total.
Total
stockpile. Yeah.
Yes, okay. Including stockpile. Yes. Can get into the little details there, but total in the world, including stockpile, is 15,000, with 90% being in the United States and Russia. And we have about, equal. So we have hundreds more than, thousands more than anyone else in the world. So we have that responsibility between us and Russia, that we must shepherd these weapons that we've created and put out into the world. And need to, especially as tensions are growing, is all the more reason why we need to have these strong and robust communication lines. And we actually used to have that during the Cold War. This is one of the things that's frustrating with the current political climate between the United States and Russia, is that we have unfortunately politicized communicating with Russia at all. Regardless of all of the other issues we have with Russia, and there are many. It's not to say that they are blameless or that we should put any of our issues with them aside. It's more to say, regardless of what other issues we have to continue to communicate with him about this issue, because we cannot allow any sort of misunderstandings to happen. Mm-hmm. We cannot allow any sort of communication breakdown to occur, because that's how you get situations like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in fact, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the inspiration for the establishment of stronger communication lines with the Soviet Union, because they were at this precipice where they didn't understand what the other was doing. They were just trying to interpret based on troop movements and missile movements. And, Kennedy was close to launching a strike against the Russians in Cuba. And that could have very likely devolved into an all-out nuclear war, because they were not communicating and they didn't have a way to communicate quickly. And we are sort of sliding backwards into that place. And that is one thing that we've been advocating for a lot, is like establish the communications, continue talking, and really to put pressure on political figures to stop making it a political issue to ignore Russia. That shouldn't be considered a politically strong thing to do. That's actually weakening our status in the world. We need to keep talking to them, even if we have issues with them. We need to keep communicating.
I guess I'm not really sure, outside of the New START treaty being re-signed, what do you know about the Biden administration and their view on the nuclear issue, and also their view on Russia?
That's definitely yet to be seen. Okay. I think we're a little too early with that, but I'm very interested, and they've tapped a number of good people in the nuclear sphere who've been doing really good work in this area, that I have hope, definitely, to see how they approach it. But obviously I'm concerned with the way that the political atmosphere around Russia and election interference might contaminate any sort of efforts. Obviously, renewing New START was a great win. And that's a great first step in the right direction. And it's just a matter of to see where you can continue to go from here.